Okay, so we've been talking about medieval art. We've been talking about this whole period, basically from the fall of Rome up until the Gothic period, which is still technically medieval, right? All right, we've been talking a little bit about also the Romanesque period. We've been talking about that here and there. We're going to really dive into Romanesque today in terms of two-dimensional art, in terms of sculpture, and in terms of architectural sculpture. When we talk about architectural sculpture, it's a little bit interesting because it's like, well, do you consider the whole building a work of art, or is just the stuff that's carved on it a work of art? So we're just going to be mainly looking at the exterior carvings on the buildings as well. We've already looked at Durham Cathedral, right? That's your kind of stereotypical, prototypical Romanesque, especially Norman Romanesque building. But there were all sorts of Romanesque churches being built at the time. They're not super unique. We've seen a few of them, right? They look pretty basic. They're your typical Roman basilica, right? Long. They're not really going to be developing the transept quite yet. Some of them will, but it's long, thick walls, narrow windows, right? Those same type of building techniques.
Wait, so they didn't have a transept?
It was just a long building. Some of them were in the round, right? Some of them were in that octagonal pattern, right? Like San Vitale in Ravenna. So we're looking at Romanesque, okay? I keep telling you we are going to get to Iberian. We will get back to that. But that's really kind of its own thing. So we're looking at Romanesque. This is the art of Europe from approximately 1000 AD to the rise of the Gothic style in the 12th century or later. So Gothic is 1100s to 1500s, but we're looking at roughly just about 100 or 200 year period, but it's going to be pretty interesting. First, we're going to look at metalwork, enamels, and ivories. All right, so sculptures.
Because I'm doing it on the Cologne Cathedral, so it looks so familiar.
Oh, okay. So you've been seeing this one. Yep.
Shrine of the Three Kings at Cologne Cathedral.
This is called the Shrine of the Three Kings.
Shrine.
Okay. So there was this explosion, this development of a lot of metalwork, right? The sculptural work that was happening during this period. Sculpture work was happening before. We looked at some of that, especially as it was being developed in monasteries. We saw some of the sacred objects, some of the chalices. We saw the tapestries, the Bayeux tapestry. That's going to be done right around this time as well. But we're looking at these metalworks, and this is when the craftsmanship really explodes. These are shrines. This is basically a reliquary. So this is a reliquary. This is called the Shrine of the Three Kings at Cologne Cathedral. It actually held multiple relics over time, and it's called the Shrine of the Three Kings because it was commissioned by a king. It was, right, there's a whole long history on just the shrine itself. But just to give you an idea of the very intricate metalwork that was being done. This was all done out of brass and bronze, and then it was gilt covered. So tiny gold leaf, right, very thin gold leaf like we've seen, was very carefully put on. So it's not pure gold. The total amount of gold on here is probably less than an ounce. But this was made out of brass or bronze.
Crazy.
So how big is that?
It's, I don't know, Maria, you tell us. No. I think it's about 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, is my guess. I don't know for certain.
Wait, so what's the shrine? It's just like, it doesn't hold anything in it?
It's a reliquary. It's a very large reliquary.
Okay.
It's a large box to hold bones of saints. Okay, so instead of a little reliquary that we see in other instances, yeah.
Wait, so how and how many is it?
I say
Mhm.
three kings if there's like multiple things. Like we three kings? Oh,
Wait,
the
is it
bones
actually-
of the three kings?
No,
Like the three
no.
bones of these?
This was commissioned by multiple kings over time. That's why it's called the Three Kings. Okay.
That'd be insane if they
Then the next that we're going to be looking at, this is called the Stavelot triptych.
Gosh, that's on the ceiling?
Everyone know what a triptych is? Tony, what's a triptych?
When you're tripping on shrooms.
It's a threefold.
It's like, yeah, like a threefold.
It's a threefold thingy.
But then it folds and closes.
Yeah,
into
Mom
one,
has
and
one.
you can open it.
So like
Yep.
your typical science fair project thing. but
Yep.
Fancy.
I'm all about this.
Yep. So it's called a triptych, right? Because there's 3 portions to it, and usually on the outside, when you close it, it's a little bit more plain on the outside. And these are used quite a bit in Eastern Orthodox, in Eastern Catholicism. There are certain parts of the ceremonies on certain days. I'm not an expert in divine liturgy, what the East calls the Mass. I'm not an expert in that, but there are certain aspects, certain days where these are closed, and then during certain parts of the divine liturgy, then they're opened.
Is that like just one open or?
It depends. It depends on the church, right? It depends on the certain thing. Sometimes during Lent, for instance, all of these will be closed. Similar to how we in the West, we put the purple cloths on the statues during Passion Week, right?
Are there two in that thing?
Yeah. So this is just kind of like, think of it like a shadow frame, like a shadow box, and then these are like the high points. So these would be tiny little books of the Gospels or representations of books of the Gospels. And then they themselves are triptychs. So again, just to give you an idea of the metalwork that's being done. Now, all the colors, that's not metal. So what's being done is they're making like these, think of it almost like a little dish, right? Think of if you take like 10 metal dishes that are really small and you put them all together, right, in a ring. Let's just imagine that. And then you take glass of various colors and you put it in each of the little dishes. So now you've got like a ring with colors of glass once it hardens up, right? That's what all of this is. A lot of this is. So this is all enamel work. So there are some jewels in here that are set in here, but a lot of this is enamel work. And sometimes you can take that glass and you can almost kind of paint with it while it's still hot, right? So that's enamel work. And so this is what they're going to be really developing. So when we talk about metalwork and enamels, a lot of those things are going to be coming together. Yeah.
So do they melt that circle?
No. So the glass would be a little bit molten, but the metal would still be. You know what? Let's do a video on how enamel work is done because I'm not explaining it well. Okay, so we'll do that at some point. But that's what enamel work is. We also have the reliquary of St. Maurus. This is holding St. Maurus.
So wait, that's like
Coffin size?
yeah, it's a body.
No, this is just holding certain parts.
Oh.
So St. Maurus was an ancient Roman saint, so they only had a few of his bones, so they would have like maybe a femur, right? So this is, again, about 3 feet long, maybe a foot tall, so not very big. One thing I haven't mentioned that is interesting to note is early churches. We see a lot of the early churches, so they're either basilicas, right, where they're pretty basic, pretty plain, right? You have your opening, you have your apse, right? Maybe sometimes you have a transept, but this is your basic basilica, okay? And then other times you'll have an octagonal or a round church, okay? This is called I forgot the term. Martyrology, martyrium, something like that. Anyway, this is a plan of a church that's meant to hold relics. So if there was a shrine, for instance, in the church housing the bones of St. Maurus, and they said, hey, let's build a church for this, they wouldn't build it in this normal basilica type. Why? Well, because a lot of pilgrims want to come. And a lot of pilgrims want to come and pay homage to the shrine of St. Maurus. So I'm going to do this a little bit bigger.
Is it just for room space?
Yep. So what they would do is when they build the church, and again, this is going to be octagonal, this isn't perfect, the altar would still be here in the center. So this is your altar. And then the people are going to be sitting here, standing here, whatever. But the shrine, and then they're going to have like these pillars all the way around. And again, I'm not drawing this perfectly, but you get the idea. Here's your door. And then you're going to have the shrine, whatever the shrine is. It could be this, it could be the crown of thorns, it could be, whatever. That way people can come in, visit, pray, and then circulate back around without disturbing the liturgy and without disturbing the Blessed Sacrament, disturbing, quote unquote, the Blessed Sacrament who's here. Does that make sense? So this is fairly common.
Kind of like
San Vitale, yep, that's exactly it.
Sorry, did you say that?
Mm-mm. So the Palatine Chapel was built after a church that was done like this. So this doesn't have, at least that I know of, I mean, it probably does have some relics in it. Every church in Europe has relics in it. But the altar here, if you look, and you can come up and look later, but the altar here is way back in the back where the sarcophagus or whatever the relics would be. Normally, that would be closer inside. Okay, yeah.
Why would they put it behind the altar?
Again, purely for practical reasons. There weren't really any laws at the time about where you should have the altar, even still today, right? There aren't necessarily laws. You look at the plan of St. Peter's, and it has like these arms like this, right? It's almost like a Greek cross. And then it's much longer here. The main altar is here. The main altar is here. There's another altar here. There's like 40 more altars all around here as well. But the main altar is here. In these larger basilicas, it was pretty standard to have, again, early on, it was pretty standard to have the altar here. And it was usually always facing east, right? So this is still facing to the east. The exception is St. Peter's.
Yeah.
That's facing east. And it's just because of the way that the Vatican and Capitoline Hills were when they originally built the first basilica. So that's why when you see pictures of the popes celebrating Mass, they're standing here and they're facing the people. But it's not that they're facing the people. So you'll see early pictures, Pope St. Pius X, Pius XII, Leo XIII, all of these early popes that we have photographic evidence of. And then all these paintings of previous popes before them celebrating Mass. This is getting into liturgy, but celebrating Mass. And you have modern Catholics saying, well, the popes are facing the people. And the answer is, they're facing east. It's just because of the way that this was built. Yeah, there's people here. Well, there's also people here. There's also people here. There's also people here. Because a lot of people go to a papal Mass. He's facing east.
Would it be wrong to build a church so that the priest is facing the people?
If you do it purposely for that reason, yes, according to the traditional norms of the church, yes. Normally, the church is always built to the east whenever possible. But this is an exception, and it just so happens to be the most important church in Christendom. But it's an exception. Okay, so just so you know. Okay, a few secular pieces have, so this wasn't just church stuff. They were doing a lot of, wealthy patrons were also able to request these beautiful things, but we're mainly just focusing on church stuff today because that's usually where the most care, the most, is that really loud? Or is there something else outside? That's really loud today. Maybe it's just warm. Anyway, this is a Paschal candlestick. This is the Gloucester Paschal candlestick. This is up in England. So during this time, this explosion of metalwork is happening all throughout Europe and into the English Isles. It's a brass. Sorry, this is a bronze Paschal candlestick. Obviously, super ornate, super beautiful. Right? It's going to take a lot of craftsmanship to be able to work the metal in that way. You have to use it while it's still hot. You have to bend it while it's still hot. But it wasn't just really beautiful things as well. We would look at this and we would go, not very pretty. Well, that's because it's made out of lead. But lead is very soft. It's very heavy, but it's very soft. It's easy to work with. Yeah. And so this was a font, a holy water font. Might have been used for Easter water as well. We're not sure. In the same cathedral. Yeah, it is. If it's ingested, yeah. So it can be. Come on. Okay. So it's easy to work with, and you can see the detail. And again, since lead is very soft, it's kind of been banged up. You can see it's started to deteriorate over time. But you can imagine what it looked like when it was first done. Not just metalwork. We have beautiful works done in ivory as well. This is a large cross, large crucifix. It's called the Cloister's Cross, made out of, various pieces of ivory, not just one piece. Ivory is elephant tusk.
That's expensive.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's illegal, isn't it?
Nowadays it is, you can't.
Elephant tusks grow back. Take them to
I think so.
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
That's a
Horns
good
do.
question. They usually don't just take the tusks.
They kill them first, yeah. Then they take the tusk, yeah.
I'm gonna
It's
take the tusk
easier.
off the album and stuff.
Because you got a 2-ton animal getting really ticked off that you're sawing off part of his body.
Nice.
That's a good question. Well, they do it for like rhinos too. Like
Yeah.
they'll kill them.
Yeah. So that's why it's illegal to buy ivory now. You can buy things that are already made out of ivory, but you can't purchase ivory tusks anymore. You're just not allowed to, for that reason, because too many poachers were just killing elephants for it. How do you carve it?
Yeah,
Tiny little chisels.
I thought they were hollow.
tiny.
Nope. They're solid. It's like a tooth.
Rhino hollow?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think they're tiny.
Hollow.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, Lots of figures of prophets and others. It's been attributed. We actually know the name of the artist. His name was Master Hugo. He also illuminated manuscripts as well.
Wait, sorry.
Hmm?
Are those like faces on the bottom of the cross?
Yeah, various figures throughout.
That's insane.
Yep. We start to see here also at the very early part of the church, there was not necessarily, you go into church today and oftentimes you'll see a large crucifix on the wall or a large crucifix hanging over the altar if it's a freestanding altar. You didn't have that originally. Originally it was just a small crucifix actually on the altar itself. That was the standard way of doing it. But during this time we start to have this idea of, well, let's make the crucifix the focal point of the church. So let's, imagine we don't have the relics here, let's put a large crucifix here. And so this is starting to become a trend, right? You don't have to do that.
Don't they do like floating?
Yeah, so sometimes they would hang it, and this is one that was mounted on a wall, but sometimes it would be hanging, right? It doesn't matter. The crucifix actually has to be standing on the altar, liturgically speaking.
Oh, really?
Yeah, generally speaking, it has to be on the altar, unless there's a space reason or you can't. But this is so we're starting to get into architectural sculpture. This was a crucifix commissioned by the Archbishop about 960, and this became a popular form. And these were later set up along the chancel arch. So this is, again, an example of really great woodworking, but you can see that it was painted as well. And it's been touched up, it's been repainted since. But this is what it originally looked like. All right, let's start to look at some of the architectural carvings.
Oh my gosh.
This is the places around the doorways of churches started to become very richly decorated. Before this point, they didn't spend a lot of time decorating the outside of the buildings. Because why? Well, during this period, they're going to start to say, well, why not? Let's give people a basic catechism as they're walking into the church. They have a catechism through images and through the liturgy itself when they're in the church. Well, let's start that process outside. And so they start to decorate and develop these areas, and the most important of which was usually what's called the tympanum. So the tympanum, this is the area above a doorway, and it's usually in an arched fashion. In the Romanesque style, it's a round arch. So this is your tympanum. It depends on what cathedral you're looking at. It depends on what doorway you're walking through, what carvings would be there. Generally speaking, we're looking at images of Christ in majesty, symbols of the four evangelists, and these are going to be influenced by these medieval manuscripts. So the medieval manuscripts are going to influence what the carvings look like as we move forward in time. A lot of this is very much space dependent, meaning the carvings are going to have to fit in a specific space, and so they're going to look a little bit strange sometimes. So when we look at some of these figures, figure of the apostles on a capital of a column. So this is blown up. This is larger than what it is in real life. We can see how they look very totally disfigured, right? But it's because, well, we want to get a carving of the apostles on there. We want to try to get all 12 on there if we can. Maybe just 6 on this one, fine. All right, we got to kind of squish them down. So you're going to start to see that quite a bit. So the subjects are made to fit. Architectural sculpture is also going to be very much influenced by, again, manuscripts. And in the manuscripts, we saw how some of these figures were just kind of forced in to fit into some of these spaces. So they're not so much interested in representation and making it look realistic. They're more interested in, hey, let's tell the story. Let's get the apostles on here. Let's tell the catechism. Well, they look like they're the Hunchback of Notre Dame. We don't care. We're telling a story here. That's more important. So the artistic representation is a little bit less important than, again, the catechism, right? They're catechizing people as they're walking into the church. It's not just for decoration. It's not just, oh, let's do some pious figures. No, it was very intentional. What are we putting on what places at what times? And let's help people understand the faith as they walk into the church or once they're in the church, as the case may be. Yeah.
The faces look so well done.
Yeah, the faces are very
The
good.
last one, I don't know who looks like Paul or something like
Right.
that. His hair and...
So actually this one, this is Christ washing the feet of the apostles.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so you can see the apostles lining up behind him, and Peter is the first, right?
Did Christ's body get knocked off, or is that?
Yeah, so there's been some damage to this capital. We're going to see a lot of what I'm going to call this spiral motif. right? There's a lot of this kind of twisting, moving pattern that you're going to see a lot in Romanesque sculpture. And that's going to, again, we can trace it. We can see where it comes from. Starts in the Norse. Then it goes to Anglo-Saxon, animal style 1, animal style 2, and then it goes into mainland Europe. And so these types of patterns, again, it's not perfectly animal style, but you can start to see the influences coming through. A lot of these decorations are done on capitals. We also have, again, correlation between manuscripts and this design as well. We also have something else interesting. This development of less sacred and sometimes even profane art starting to make its way onto the outside of churches. So sometimes they're going to be saying, you know, as you enter the doorway, as you go into the tympanum, right, it's almost like you're entering into the gate of heaven. So there's Christ and there's the apostles and there's the sacred figures. But on the outside parts of the church, where you're not entering in, sometimes they would put less sacred objects, less sacred works. And so we start to see depictions of demons, of devils, on certain parts of the outside of the church. Now, why would you put a devil on a church?
Yeah.
Well, because he's on the outside. Again, it's catechism in carving, right? Demons are on the outside, and they're always facing the outside of the church, whereas Christ and the apostles are starting to face inwards. And so you're leaving the devils and the demons outside. They're almost kind of fleeing from the stone, from the carvings on the outside of the church, and then you can enter in where there are no demons and there are no devils, right? So we start to see this idea of we're going to put we're going to start to put the less sacred things on the outside. We're going to put the sacred things on the inside.
Is that art history?
Yeah. There's a note right here. There's a thing. Just have a seat. And it wasn't just demons and devils. You'd see depictions of actual events. So this is a depiction of Judas being hung with demons nipping at his heels, right? So again, he's on the outside, right? Because he didn't care to, or he didn't want to, he wasn't able to, whatever. You know the story. But again, all this stuff is going to be on the outside. As we move into the Renaissance, we're going to start to see more depictions of the Last Judgment, more fearsome things happening inside the church. But during this period, inside the church, it's all light, it's all bright, it's all happy saints, right? Good things. On the outside, that's where we have the demons and the figures. We're on the back of the first page.
Felt tight.
The only page.
Right. How do we some tissue space?
Okay. Sometimes the sculptors are going to have some fun, and we're going to see this even more as we move into the Gothic period with gargoyles. These are kind of the first. This is kind of where gargoyles come from, although gargoyles are going to serve an actual purpose. But we can see a monk who has had too much to drink, and so he's holding the barrel of ale and he's throwing up, right? So this is depicting the sin of gluttony, right? So sometimes they would depict the 7 deadly sins on the outside of the cathedral. You're going to leave those behind. Then now you come in, and now you can come in to be sanctified. And we see a lot more of these, again, the demons swallowing their own tails, right? Chasing their own tails for eternity. That's going to be happening over and over again. But again, there's a direct link, a direct correlation. Norse, Anglo-Saxon, manuscripts, now it's making its way onto actual carvings in the cathedrals.
People who carve these things, do they think about doing this, or are they told to?
A lot of them had absolutely free reign in what they wanted to do. Yeah. Oops. Figurative sculptures. As we move into the later Romanesque, the sculptures are going to get progressively better very quickly. We're going to see some of these cathedrals have sculptures that are going to be very lifelike, very, very realistic. Again, yeah, this is a very big leap forward all of a sudden really fast during the Romanesque period. Not all the cathedrals later on are going to have this same sort of artistic method, but we're going to see it here.
It's like Santa Claus.
They just got better. They're spending more time doing carvings, and they're getting a lot better at it. Mm-hmm. They're also going to be interested in trying to make things look as realistic as possible, again, because that's going to tell the story a lot more easily. This is in Santiago de Compostela. This is dating from 1180, so a little bit into the Gothic period. But this is the Portico de Gloria, so the Portico of Glory. We have all the saints and the prophets and the apostles, and they were painted a lot more brightly than they are today.
Would you think those are like the four evangelists?
I think so, yeah.
John, the younger one?
Seems so.
Probably because it's.
Who do you think that?
All right, let's quickly look at wall paintings. Wall paintings. This is, and I think I've mentioned this before in another class, but we have, during this period, we have this influx from the east to the west of these Eastern painters, of these painters from the Byzantine style. Why? Because they weren't allowed to paint, or they were, even if the iconoclast controversy was over, they're not sure if they're going to still be allowed to paint, and so there's going to be a huge influx of these Eastern painters that are going to be coming in. This is a wall painting that's actually in Spain, and if you just looked at it, you would say, no, it's absolutely Byzantine, right? Or it's absolutely Eastern. No, it's in Spain. We have this influx of people traveling the Mediterranean and coming in and looking for work. The colors are very vibrant, and it's really well preserved. And we see a lot of Eastern motifs here, right? We see the way that the angels are depicted. We see the ways that the saints down on the bottom are depicted. Christ holding the book, and the book is the perspective. It's totally different. We have the letters on the side, and then we have the mandorla, right? This almond-shaped halo, essentially, around the whole body of Christ. It's all Eastern, all of it. But it's going to make its way into Romanesque art. In these areas below the domes, we also see the same sort of thing, right? A lot of Byzantine influence. That shading, that coloring, they're not really going to be shading and totally coloring it in. It's dark light to do the shadows.
I was seeing like a puppet, like Pinocchio.
Yeah. This is in the apse of a church, right? So the very front of the church. And again, you see depictions, right? Mary and Peter and some of the other evangelists next to them.
Oh wow.
So obviously it's deteriorated a little bit, but we have, again, this very Eastern, very static, very staid. Not a lot of emotion, not a lot of movement, or if there is movement, it's all very geometric, like we saw in the previous one.
Pictures like these were like each of the apostles very like easy to pick out, like
Yeah.
Saint Peter has the key. And then
Right. Yeah, people would know who is who in those certain cases. On the north wall of the church, now they're going to start to develop, where do we put certain paintings of certain things,
the
right?
wall inside the church.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So, obviously a depiction of Christ, or if the church is dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Mary is going to be on the front and center, or Christ is going to be on the front and center. That's still going to be the case. Or in some cases, you might have a particular saint depicted, but even still, not usually. Usually it's Christ or Mary at the very front, or at the apse, or in the dome, or something like that. But along the walls, now they're going to start to say, hey, let's start to paint some pictures. Again, earlier Romanesque churches are not going to have a lot of paintings on the inside. It's just they don't have the time to do it, or they don't have the artistry to do it, but we're going to start to see a development of this, starting to cover a lot of the walls with a lot of paintings. And again, this is happening just in certain pockets. But on the north side of the church, you're going to usually have the Old Testament. On the south side of the church, you're going to have the New Testament, right? And that's going to carry over. We're going to see that same correlation happening. North side, Old Testament, south side, New Testament. Seniors, do you remember why that is? Why the Old Testament on the north? Why the New Testament on the south?
Wait, I thought it's the other way around.
Is it because like
Wait, no, it's not.
Old-
like
Two reasons.
is that because of like geography, like people in the north, people in the south?
Yeah, there was some of that. So the second reason, the less important reason, but the reason is most of the people who were the pagans in the pagan lands, according to where the church was at this time, were in the north. And so they're usually preaching to the north, right? The Old Testament prophets are preaching to the north. And then you don't receive the Gospels until you come into the church, until you become baptized. The other reason is the north is dark. In the northern hemisphere, the north is dark. The sun is generally in the south, right? It goes from east to west, but it's generally in the south, right? So the north side of the church is always in the shadows. The south side of the church is always in the light. So the north side of the church, before the Redeemer, Old Testament. South side of the church, after the Redeemer, New Testament, right? So you're always going to, not always, many, many times you're going to see that, right? Even in new churches that are still being built today, they're still following a lot of that same tradition. Wall paintings were, more often than not, they were not as complex as this, but we're going to start to see a lot of development in artistic styles.
So how would this do?
They're being martyred
Why would they put that in a church?
because it was a church dedicated to their martyrdom. So they're going to be. So this is just one little section of
What are they doing to this?
this painting.
That's a little more bright.
A little more bright.
The middle row's like upside down.
Yeah, so it just kind of depends on where you're sitting. Imagine being a kid and being like,
How'd you pay attention to that?
yeah.
That's true. That'd be me.
Yeah.
All right, next week we'll look at monasteries.